I don't think Nigel would want Boris to. I saw him after my announcement, and he said, "You broke my heart. We made a mistake in the Boris administration about allowing migration to spike so massively,
700,000 people,
without thinking about GDP per capita."
Does Nigel really want the job of being Prime Minister? So welcome to the Policy Fix. I'm Steve Rigby, Chief Exec of the Rigby Group, one of the UK's largest private businesses. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Nadhim Zahawi, the founder of YouGov, and a person that's held many significant political positions in the UK, including Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it's fair to say in 2026, Nadhim's made a lot of headlines with his defection to reform, and we're going to cover that today. But in the first part, we'll talk about some of the key business issues he's experienced in his career and that are affecting the UK today. So Nadhim will share with us some of the experience he's had in his business and political career, talk about some of the mistakes he's made along that journey, and importantly, how we'll fix some of those in reform. This is a punchy episode. You won't want to miss this. So Nadhim, welcome to the Policy Fix.
Great to be with you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's been quite a long time, hasn't it, actually? Interestingly, we were actually near neighbours for a number of years.
Absolutely right.
And you were the MP for Stratford-upon-Avon, which is where we're headquartered. So hence we've known each other quite some years.
We certainly have.
So you've had a very storied political career, sir, I have to say. I looked last night at the amount of roles that you've had, some shorter than others, including Chancellor for 2 days. But, you've been chairman of the Conservative Party, you've been, various ministers, you've been a Secretary of State, Duchy of Lancaster. Yeah. I mean, you've really had an incredible journey in politics. A lot of that actually towards the back end of your journey, and not least around COVID, around the vaccines, which you led, and we'll come on to talk about that in a short while. But just give us a little flavour of that experience that you went through.
You're quite right, Steve. I normally describe myself as sort of the summer intern in the Treasury. I did about 2 months, I think, and then moved to the Cabinet Office for the 46 days of Liz Truss, and then ended up finally as chairman of the party before leaving government. I think the most interesting role I had, and probably played to my strength. I'm a chemical engineer by background, as you know. I like to build things. Process is important. Data is important, because without data you can't really make decisions. Evidence-based decisions are important, in government or in business. You know that from your success. The vaccine rollout was really the one that I think played to, I hope, my strength, but also was the most interesting, because we had to build. Once we sort of knew, because of the work that Kate Bingham did, it was brilliant. We brought in an outside expert who knew not necessarily vaccines, but knew the whole sort of industry, pharma industry, and therefore she was able to put all those skills of private equity, of investing, into knowing which teams are most likely to succeed. So once Kate had basically said, look, thumbs up, I think we're close to getting at least one, maybe 2 vaccines, we then had to build an infrastructure from a standing start. There wasn't a UK vaccination infrastructure at that scale. The country does school vaccines, we did different vaccines through the NHS, but nothing at that scale where we knew we needed to get to sort of 1 million doses a day if we were going to a race against time, basically. And so I was drafted in by the Prime Minister. I'll never forget, he rang on my mobile on the weekend to say, typical Boris sort of thing, you're going to be my Beaverbrook. You're an engineer, I'm told you can get things done. And I said, it'd be a privilege, Prime Minister, of course. But I paused. Why did I pause? Because I saw some of the, some will call it a mess. Others will say, huge challenges around PPE, procurement, which was difficult.
But hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Hindsight's a wonderful thing.
A wonderful thing.
Exactly. Or test and trace. So I said, look, I'll take on the job on one condition. And typically of Boris, what's that? And I said, well, I've got to be able to speak with your authority. The response comes back, what does that mean? And I said, it means I've got to be able to access you in minutes, maximum, a couple of hours, not days and weeks, right? Because I'm the minister in charge. I can't have the gatekeepers keeping me away from you, because I'm going to have to do things so quickly, make decisions so fast if we're going to win this race against this virus that I need at least to know that I've got access to you. Now, I almost never needed to use it, right? But it was just the system knowing that I can talk to the Prime Minister in a minute and get a response from him made the system much more responsive or capable of actually taking my instructions much more seriously. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
We embedded our best from our military into the NHS. These guys were in charge of delivering supplies to the front lines in Afghanistan and Iraq, and being late by a minute is not an option because people die. And Brigadier Phil Prosser did an incredible job with his team. We had a wonderful lady who was actually, again, external and came into initially the NHS to try and help begin the reform process of the NHS. But of course, the pandemic hit. Emily Lawson, phenomenal human being. Sadly, we lost her to the civil service after the pandemic. We had some amazing civil servants. People always attack the blob and the civil service. It's not true. I mean, Maddie McTernan, who's now at the MOD, running the nuclear submarine program. Without her, Kate Bingham couldn't have done her job because Kate would obviously identify which teams, whether it's Pfizer or the Oxford team with AstraZeneca, we were going to put our money behind. But contract was important. And without Maddie McTernan and Ruth Todd, who no one will ever probably hear of, but they're the real heroines of the vaccine deployment, the contracts had to be really, rigorously gone through and airtight.
But we also took a lot of risk. I mean, we had multiple contracts out there. Which that compressing of government decision making showed that actually when Britain gets its act together, we can do amazing things. First in the world to get the vaccine, significantly ahead of the Europeans. And I think,
and by the way, that was people always sort of have a go at, and it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on Brexit. I was a Brexiteer, and we can talk about that for hours. I think Europe has, when you're seeing a headline today in Bloomberg saying that French finance real estate in Paris is on its knees because office blocks are half empty. They're still in Europe. They've got huge challenges, and I think they're right to sort of want to move on and address those. But we were right to sort of come out. And part of the reason we could be successful in buying the vaccines in the first place and then deploying them early, well ahead of Europe, is because we weren't part of that club. Otherwise, we would have been held back.
Yes. In fact, they tried to hold us back.
Correct.
So if we look at where we are today with the pharmaceutical industry, we had this great moment 5 years ago, really showed the very best of Britain. But today, AstraZeneca just placed $15 billion of investment in China. In fact, I saw a senior exec from AstraZeneca last week. And the UK just isn't competitive, and we're losing some of that momentum. So what's driving it? You've got very close to the pharmaceutical sector, but what's driving that change, do you believe?
You're absolutely right. And we'll talk about my driver behind moving from the Conservative Party to Reform. It breaks my heart to see, Sir Pascal Soriot, and you got his knighthood because of the work he did on the vaccine for the pandemic. An extraordinary leader of AstraZeneca, would love to invest in the UK if he thought it was economically viable. And it's just become uneconomic to invest in the United Kingdom. That's a terrible place to be. It's all well and good to pander to the unions and say, we're going to have an employment rights bill. It's an unemployment. It's a destructive bill because what it does, it stops investment, right? Why? Because whether you're a small business or a large business, if you can't right-size your business depending on where the market's going, where sales are at, where your profitability is at, you're going to be much more reluctant to hire people, right? The world has changed even more so post-pandemic in that talent is so mobile, right? And it's not just the billionaires and millionaires and the non-doms who've left these shores and have ended up in Italy and Milan and Dubai and elsewhere. It's what I call the young talent, which is even more important, the sort of the 30 to 45-year-olds who are now thinking, there's no future in whether it's pharma or engineering or whatever work they do, because we've been living off the legacy of Thatcher and the employment reforms she introduced. And now we're moving towards what we know doesn't work, which is the European model, where you can't let people go when the company needs to right-size itself.
Yes.
And that's problematic. And you see people like Pascal having to really make decisions they don't want to make. They love this country. They want to be here.
It is the biggest business in the country, £250 billion market valuation. The fact that we are, though, 3% of the world GDP. We're a relatively small market. It's a truly global business. They've got optionality. We've got to treat those organisations like they will leave rather than just assume that they're going to stay. We've got to make sure that we're competitive on every level.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So one of the great things about you is that you went through and created your own company, and you've gone on to chair lots of businesses after your political career. And the business you formed was a business you started in 2000 and sold very successfully in 2010. Just tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So it feels like we're in a similar place. In fact, probably an even more significant place now today in 2026 as we were in 1999, 2000. So in 2000, it was the beginning of the real adoption of the internet. It was the days of America Online and dial-up connections. I think only about 27% of the UK had adopted this thing called the internet. We had Yahoo and Netscape and Small World, and I think Facebook started at the same time as YouGov, about 2000, and I had the great luck, I suppose, of meeting Stephen Shakespeare, who's a brilliant man, who was my co-founding partner, and we thought that this was a moment because as the world begins to connect through this thing called the internet, then the way we can harness public opinion. We both come from a political background, so we're sort of public opinion anoraks. We were consuming lots of telephone surveys and face-to-face, clipboard surveys. We thought this thing called the internet is going to change all of that, right? Because surely
make it much easier to
what's going to happen is you can connect millions of people, right? Instead of having to do 1,000 people, with a clipboard and knocking on doors, right? Randomly, or ringing people up and having to talk to them for 25, 30, 40 minutes, you're going to connect them on this giant thing called the internet. Now, can you make sense of that data was the challenge. Can you model it? Because all market research, whether political or market research, is in the business of modeling. And our hypothesis was actually, rather than randomly calling people who then you can't get back to afterwards, right? Wouldn't it be better if we built a very large panel? So in the UK, our target was about, I think, 300,000, 350,000.
Which is a vast data set.
Right. And then start asking them all sorts of questions to learn more about them. And then the computers, the machines, would choose 5,000 people. We'd invite them to a survey. We usually get a response rate about 50%, so 2,500 would respond back. That's much closer to the makeup of the nation.
Statistical.
Correct. The adult population of the UK. And that must be better quality. Now, it took us a while to convince the world that that's better quality. One of the challenges is we launched the business, and about, I think, 2-3 weeks later, the whole dot-com bubble burst, right? There was no money. Nobody wanted to talk to us. I fell back on, getting huge advice from my father because I'd never really done it. My last startup was a failure before YouGov.
We've all had those, don't worry.
Right. And we just had to keep going. And then what we did, and again, all these moments, any businessman, any entrepreneur says to you, I designed my whole business plan and I've delivered on every bit of it without any luck, without any fortune, is either naive or is lying to you, in my view.
I'd be very surprised if that starting business plan resembles the business at all towards the end.
Exactly right. So what we had was a plan to connect local government, right? Because everyone was still paying their taxes with a check, right? We thought actually what we would do is connect people to be able to pay their tax online, and then we get their views online, because then they would be able to tell their local authority, Warwickshire County Council, look, we want you to spend our money in this way or that way, and so on. We very quickly worked out that these giant companies like EDS and Capita and probably your father's company, were much bigger than us in terms of knowing how to connect with legacy computer systems and local authorities. But what worked was the public opinion bit. So we pivoted, dropped the tax payment systems. Someone else does that better than us. We just started getting into the business of building panels, and we went to see a wonderful human being and a great supporter of ours, Stanley Calmes, Lord Calmes. Who was
Dixon's.
Yes.
He was a ruthless man.
Ruthless.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, very successful.
But he just launched something called Freeserve. And we thought, what better way to build a representative panel is the average British family goes into PC World or Currys, buys a computer, and they get a Freeserve disk with it in those days.
Yes.
And so when they load it up, right, Freeserve is the portal. We went and presented to him in his office in Mayfair, in fact, of Palm Street, the head office. I'll never forget that. He said, you got 5 minutes, you pair of jokers, right? 45 minutes later, I thought we must be doing something right because we're still in the room. He hasn't thrown us out. And then he tells his PA, look, ask Ajaz to come up. He had this young man called Ajaz Ahmed who had been the manager of the Manchester branch of PC World, who'd come up with the idea of Freeserve. Anyway, Ajaz comes up, and by the end of the week, we're the news channel on Freeserve. So everyone clicking on any news stories would come to YouGov. And we hired a bunch of young journalists out of journalism school with a editor who would be a professional editor from the Sun newspaper, funny enough. And we would cull the news every night, 24/7, and put half a dozen questions at the bottom to get people used to answering questions on them. No one, we're sitting here today in 2026. You answer questions about everything all the time, right?
Yes.
In those days, no one had even thought of the idea of putting questions at the end of news stories or anything like that. Anyway, and that's how we were collecting the panel. That's how we built the panel.
Amazing.
But we were running out of money. So we had to come up with something to be able to prove to the world that's going to pay us for our work that we're more accurate, we're better quality than the telephone or face-to-face guys. And that's where the next bit of luck came in, is there's something called the British Election Study, which is the sort of the Rolls-Royce, the highest academic study that goes around democracy. It's the Australian election study, the American election study, and it's administered by a bunch of universities. And one of the guys that worked for us knows the team that was doing it. So we approached them and said, look, it's the general election, 2021. Would you allow us to be part of the study? Because they give their work to the telephone and the clipboard. People like Maury and Sir Bob Worcester or Gallup and others. They said, yes, we'd love you to. We've heard about this thing. We've heard about your work at YouGov. We'd love to do it. I was like, great. Where do we sign? So the contract comes in and it's got £0 on it because they'd actually already allocated all the funding to the other two. And that's when you've got to make a decision, right? And I said, it doesn't matter. This is our last chance, right? We probably won't be around after the general election anyway. But our data's so good. Let's take the chance. Let's take the risk and join in. And they had a condition that we had to give them the raw data as well as the model, right, to the academics for them to then scrutinize after the election. Of course, we wiped the floor with the traditional researchers. After the election, they write up the whole study, and this thing that YouGov has done is pretty remarkable.
And that set you on your journey.
Once academia believed that the methodology was robust, was accurate, everything else becomes, we win every which way. It's faster, deeper, cheaper, all the things, right? For any business today, if you're going to do market research that is at speed, but also you're able to react to it, because I'll show you some data for your business, and you say, that's really interesting. Can we go back to that group of people and really dig deep and understand what they're doing? And of course, the really exciting bit, I think, for my old friends at YouGov, is what's happening now with AI, because you're going to be able to do focus groups where traditionally there were sort of 14 people in a room, and you ask them all sorts of deep questions, and it's thick old report. Imagine you can do a focus group now with 1 million people.
Yes.
Because the AI can basically structure it, and you get the primary data from 1 million human beings but really deep, as in understanding their emotions, their motivations, everything
it's
about
going
it.
to upend many industries,
incredible.
including the one that you're from. Around the same time, you would have been in your early 30s that you were dealing with Stanley Calms. I was also in my mid-20s, also doing the same, selling a business to PC World. We had their number 2 operator in the UK. And I was doing it against John Pletherow, who went on to run Cable and Wireless.
Yeah.
Terry Duddy went on to run Argos.
Yes.
And they were all schooled in that style of negotiation that Calms had, which was brutal. It taught me an awful lot, that experience in life. If we look at business leaders in government, I mean, you're a rare exception in that situation. I look at Andrew Griffiths today in the Conservatives. I regard him highly. Had a big job in Sky.
One of my closest friends.
But we're missing a lot of business experience in the current government. And I am politically neutral, so I'm not here to criticise one party versus the next. But we are missing lots of business experience. If we look at the US and what's happening there, we've got the opposite challenge. So, frankly, we've got people negotiating with Russia who haven't got statecraft, who haven't had experience of negotiating in that way. And it feels as though we've swung way too far the other way in the US. But I think where we are today in the UK, we're just lacking experience, frankly. Experience of transformation, of growth, of managing complex teams, of clear communication, long-term strategy. All those things you and I both know you learn in business in spades. How do we attract more business people, if not to be in politics, to be on the side of politics, helping and contributing to society?
I think you've really sort of hit the nail on the head, Steve, on this, for a couple of reasons. One, it's not just the politicians that lack business experience. If you take the makeup of Parliament, where that's the talent pool from which we basically choose the Prime Minister, who is the equivalent of the
Chief Exec
of UK PLC, and then the different Secretaries of State who are effectively managing directors of a massive part of that PLC, right? I mean, I had a budget in the Department of Education of something like £86 billion, right? 9,800 people just in the main employment of the Department of Education. So it's not just the politicians. I would say if you sat around this table, the senior civil servants, the permanent secretaries, they would say to you that many of them have come from a background of reading PPE, history, maybe English, law, all the things that make you able to analyze brilliantly. They're very big brains, much bigger than my brain will ever be, right? But very few have practical, what I would call operational experience, like engineers do, right? And so I think one of the challenges we've got is, how do you attract into the civil service more people who are comfortable being the senior responsible officer? SRO is what they're called. So Emily Lawson was the SRO for the vaccine deployment, right? And actually, the moment I got in and kicked the tires with her, I knew all I had to do was just protect her and her team, right? And facilitate the decision-making for them so they can hit their targets, because she was just brilliant. Right? I didn't need to worry about my leadership. I just need to protect them.
If you've got a good exec, you just leave them to do their job.
You got it, right? So the problem is not just in the makeup of the politicians, i.e. Parliament is not attracting the right experience of individuals. It's also the civil service, right? And that's a real challenge. Now, there is a way of doing it in the sense that what Nigel Farage and I have discussed is what worked during the pandemic is our ability to say someone like Kate Bingham, look, give me 6 to 10 months of your life, right? And the reward may not be, monetary, financial. She doesn't need the money, right? She's a very successful private equity in pharma industry, but she wants to feel, one, that she did the right thing in the equivalent of a world war against a virus. Two, that then she's recognised for that. I think there'll be lots of business leaders who, if we go to them and say, look, give me 12 months of your life, right? But by the way, here's the deal. And this is the bit that's crucial, right, that I've discussed with Nigel, is when they come in and give you 12 months of their life, these are busy people, right? You've got to give them the levers so they can make decisions.
Yes.
Right?
And today that doesn't happen.
Correct.
Yes.
Today what happens, right? You bring in someone.
Poppy would be a good example that went into Office for Investment.
You got it, right? And they've got no decision-making power. Mm-hmm. It all rests with the civil service. So one idea I've got is to say, look, and maybe we do it on a cross-party basis, or we just do it if we win the election, is to say any Secretary of State can bring in half a dozen experts, right, in their field. Mm-hmm. Vetting should be rigorous, but fast. Mm-hmm. Right? It took me 12 months to convince Sir Peter Bazalgette, who's brilliant at what he does in business and in the creative industries, to be a non-exec director at the Department of Education. I was actually leaving the department to go to the Treasury to be Chancellor when he finally came in, and I had the support of my Perm Secretary, Susan Ackland-Hood. Everybody wanted him. Yeah. 12 months.
It's not good enough.
It's crazy. Yeah. No one can wait that long, right?
In this modern day world, we can't afford to waste 12 months on anything.
You got it. So I think the idea that we will deliver against, and I'm confident we can, is the ability to vet fast, get them in, and then give them the ability to make decisions inside the government machine.
And I think doing that on a short-term basis is key. The other challenge you have as a businessman going into government is having to relinquish everything you've spent your life building, which isn't practical in many circumstances. So I think there's much change needed, but I do think we should bring business closer to government. It doesn't mean that business should be running government, but it means we should be leveraging that skill and capability. It's about assembling the best possible team that you can do.
Exactly right. And I think the other thing that I would say we should have taken advantage of is that sense of urgency that we had during the pandemic has just gone away.
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
Right.
And it proves we can do it.
We can do it, right? If any other country in the world, right, and we can talk about this if you like, but this is obviously a business led podcast, that had a problem, right, where it was basically getting 66,000 to 70,000 illegal people coming in every year, that would be a national emergency. Right? I can guarantee you, I mean, I travel a lot around the world, right? Any other country in the world, if you say to them, look, by the way, let me put a scenario to you, right? You are getting undocumented young men, right, about 70,000 a year. What would you do? They'd call a national emergency, right? They would get every bit of their government, the military, the intelligence agencies, every bit of their government around the table and say, national emergency, how do we stop this now?
I mean, migration's a global challenge. You know, we have a global south moving north.
I don't disagree with you.
That's a challenge.
I don't disagree with you. But my point being is, how do we just accept that this is happening every single day, right? We can talk about migration separately, right?
Yes.
And I've got views on that from what I've seen as the best and the mistakes we've made.
You yourself, your family were migrants.
Absolutely. And I've got to put my hand up. I think we made a mistake in the Boris administration about allowing migration to spike so massively.
700,000 people.
Without thinking about GDP per capita.
Yes.
Right? That whole sort of drive from the Treasury was, it doesn't matter. As long as you're getting volume, right, GDP will grow.
Yes.
Not true. No. Right? We now know that the evidence is the opposite of that. Yes. And that was a mistake. And
we need skilled GDP capital.
Correct. Yeah. And that's what, when you look at countries like the UAE, right, what they've done there, they've taken their population to, today it's probably about, I would say, somewhere between 12 and 14 million, right, of which about 1.3, 1.4 million are UAE nationals. The rest are all talent from around the world.
I mean, you've just flown back in there from there this morning. I'm out there next month, have a couple of businesses in that region. And I know if you don't have a job, within a month you have to leave. I mean,
Correct.
We've got very, very different policies than
Correct.
some of these very dynamic countries that are out there. So if we look at one of the things the government I do think has done well on is the industrial strategy. Mm-hmm. So Greg Clark conducted the last one. Unfortunately, Boris killed that within a couple of years. The work that's been done feels good, but as you and I both know, a strategic plan has a danger of just going straight in a drawer, and it's actually the next phase of implementation that matters. When you're trying to change the direction of a country, that's a long-term game. So we might start to see some output in 3 or 4 years' time. What is your view from a reform perspective on the longevity of that strategy, and is that something that you see reform, crystallising the work that's been done?
So I think Richard Tice has been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking around this, and I think the mistake successive governments have made is to be dogmatic about this, right? industrial strategy doesn't mean that you're a big state interventionist government.
No.
What it does mean is you look at what Richard's been doing on energy costs for industry, right? We are an outlier, right? I think we're 4 times more expensive on energy costs for industry than America, right? That's insane. If you had, I think, carried on with the industrial strategy, you take that Greg Clark document and then begin to operationalize it, you'd have probably, under a Conservative government, got to a place to say, actually, this is mad. We've got to fix energy first.
Yes, you'd have got there sooner.
You would have got there sooner, right? We didn't. What happened was it just became a ill-informed debate that people who, for whatever reason, emotional, and I respect them for that, but I wouldn't make decisions just based on emotion, right? Felt, no, we've got to carry on with this net zero thing. Let's just keep adding costs to business, right? If we'd followed the evidence, you'd have probably, as you say, got there sooner. So
19% of energy costs relate to policy decisions.
You got it, right? So I guess my counsel to my colleagues in reform is to say, follow the evidence. Having a really good industrial strategy is a good thing, right? Because look at the most successful countries around the world, right? We just talked about the UAE. Look at Singapore. Look at what's happening in
China's plan. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Right. Part of that, it forces you to begin to look at the evidence. It forces you to look at the competitive analysis, right? You do an audit of, okay, who am I competing with, right? What are they doing, and how is that working? You look at now today in another area which I worry about is, the AIM market. When I was launching YouGov, AIM market was brilliant, dynamic.
And now it's a dying market.
Now it's a dying market. Where have we gone wrong on things like that? You look at our industrial base, where you and I hail from. What is happening to the auto industry? Why are we having such difficulties, right? Part of it, again, I have to say, put my hand up, take it away. I was around the cabinet table when people started, almost outbidding one another. How quickly can we phase out not just the internal combustion engine, but the hybrid? I'm like, what are we doing? I go home and sort of think, okay, it's not my bailiwick, it's not my department, but
we're less than 1% of global emissions.
It's mad, right? So what I'm seeing now from Nigel and Richard and the team actually is sensible people with a business background who go, hold on a second, right? Yeah, of course we have a responsibility, but I'm not going to kill my economy, right, whilst everybody else does well based on emotion. That's not going to happen anymore. Same applies with immigration, right? As you say, if you are contributing, as a Brit would in Dubai today, they're having a great life.
Yes,
they're very welcome. They get all the support. They get all the services.
If they don't, they're not welcome.
And they pay for it. And if they don't, they're not welcome.
Yeah.
That is not that doesn't make you a bad person.
No.
Right? That's my point.
That's a social compact.
It's exactly
you
right.
put into society. Just turning to that, Charlie Mayfield, someone we both will know. I respect him highly, as a businessman and what he's done in government. But I just read the report he produced recently around worklessness, and it almost felt like he was putting the blame on business, which for me just feels wrong. The issue I sense, as I'm sure you probably will do, is the welfare system is just incentivising worklessness. It's incentivising being passed across by a doctor with a disability, mental health or physical. What is your view there in terms of how we go about reform? Because it's clear right now we're not going to reform it in this Parliament.
I think you're absolutely right, and I've got a lot of time for Charlie. Did some amazing things at his own business at the John Lewis Partnership. I just think you have to look at the evidence, right? And I understand if people want to feel better about themselves by kicking, capitalism, by kicking the wealth creators, by kicking the entrepreneurs. That's not where it's at. The reality, if you look at the evidence, what happened, right? The reforms that Ian Duncan Smith came up with when we were in opposition were the right reforms, right, for welfare. But then the implementation has been terrible. Why do I say that? All you have to do is, again, and I think Fraser Nelson's done some really good work on this.
Yes.
He loves data,
Yeah.
Fraser. When you see things like a massive spike in mental ill health, right, and a lot of it is around anxiety. Now, mental ill health is a very important issue. No disagreement. Has to be dealt with by both the health service, but also by businesses. No disagreement.
But we also have to have self-resilience.
You've got it.
Yeah.
So, and I would say I would implore any decent employer that they would make sure that their people are well supported, right? If they have issues, but at the same time, something must be wrong that anxiety becomes something that we can't deal with in the workplace. You should be able to get the support and still work.
Absolutely.
Right? If you have an issue around anxiety, right? We've just gone so far towards a system that basically says it's pretty easy for me to stay at home and be signed off because I just don't feel like doing it anymore. And that is a spiral towards economic decline.
Yes.
And I think in many ways the nation would get that. People would understand. One of the great, I always say it when I travel around the world, there are two great gifts this country's given me, right, as someone who the adopted son of the United Kingdom. One is that resilience, that when we are facing crisis, whether it was the Second World War or the pandemic, right, we come together, we set our politics aside. I worked with the SNP in Scotland, with the mayors all around the country who had different political persuasions, but we came together and we smashed the virus, right? And so we're resilient. And two, our sense of fair play, right? The Brits have a great instinct for fairness. And I think the nation would see this is just not fair and it's wrong.
I think the public does see that. The challenge we have is that the members of Parliament unfortunately don't.
Correct.
And, they're not prepared to make seismic change. And of course you're going to have a situation where one person is negatively impacted over another, and we have to find a way through that situation. But to stay as we are, unfortunately, we're going to break our own country.
It's not an option.
It's not an option. I think that's one area that, as Reform starts to think about its policies, thinking that issue through, how we make that seismic change is pretty critical. Linked to that is AI, and we clearly both experienced people. I'm talking more and more these days, rather than the haves and the have-nots, I'm talking about have AI and have not AI in your life. And those people that have the intelligence and experience to use these tools day in, day out are going to have a significant advantage versus those people that haven't had access to those tools, either via their employer or personally. And the ability for inequality to widen is very significant. We're going to see that with countries. We're going to see it with populations. We're going to see it with companies growing too fast. The hyperscalers and their cash flow machines are giving them this huge advantage of making long-term investments that are beyond the scale of our country. Just this week, Amazon announced $200 billion. That's bigger than Morocco's economy, and that's 1 year's spend. So to compete against these countries and organisations is becoming very difficult. So we are going to create this divide in our country unless we do something about it. Any views there from a policies perspective on where you think reform might go on AI?
Absolutely. One, we need to be as far away from the European mindset as possible. If you talk to anybody...
This is regulation.
Regulation. Yeah. That knows anything about what is happening in Europe will say to you, it is a desert. There may be one or two interesting companies, but most companies just look at... You can't regulate before an industry becomes... truly active and prosperous.
Yes.
Right? The right way to do it, which has always been the United Kingdom's instinct, even when I was launching YouGov, is you let 1,000 flowers bloom and then you go back and say, actually, is there misbehaviour? Right? Is there
But I think we're broadly doing that right, aren't we, right now?
We are.
Yeah.
And I have to say, credit where credit's due. It was Rishi who really sort of had thought through some of this stuff. Where I think we have a real opportunity, and I just wish I wasn't in government then, but I wish we'd never sold the business. And I know probably some of my friends at Alphabet and others will say otherwise. We should have never sold DeepMind. Right? And Sir Demis Hassabis, I think, if there is one person I'd bet on, right? You remember what I said to you at the beginning?
Is a genius. Yeah.
About when we launched YouGov, it was America Online, where are they today? Yahoo, Netscape, all these other guys, right?
Yeah.
My Place and the market shakes out.
Yes.
Right? That's a good thing. That's great capitalism.
Yeah.
But the work that he's doing with Alphabet's incredible ability on the work they're doing on TPUs.
TPUs, yeah.
And then, of course, their distribution capability because of Gmail and all the Chrome and everything else they've got. I wouldn't bet against them.
Listen, they are the largest company in the world in the making right now, so
Right.
they're going to get there. There's no doubt. They're going to own robotics for Android, and they really are.
Exactly.
They're in quantum. I mean, they're an amazing company.
Exactly. I just wish we could build those sort of businesses in the UK. One of the challenges, I wrote about this very early on in my career as your Member of Parliament in Stratford-on-Avon, is we do well at sort of Series A and B rounds, where people can raise, the first bit, 1 to 5 million, and then 5 to 50, 5 to 100 million. But then we fall off a cliff, and they have to go to Silicon Valley if they're going to start raising the serious money.
I'm lucky to be a prolific investor in AI, one of the biggest in the UK. And I do see the UK having an opportunity. It's not at the very largest companies.
Yeah.
We shouldn't forget the US is 9.5 times our economy. Yeah. It's got huge pools of capital. Risk appetite is very different. But I do see that next layer down as a real opportunity. But somehow thinking about the societal shift in government, I think today we're playing lip service. If we don't get that tackled sooner or later, then I think we're going to have some major challenges.
By the way, including in education. I
Yes.
mean, I see some of the stuff happening now in America. There's this incredible guy I met who was an entrepreneur. Now he calls himself a school principal. And somebody says to me, he's one of the most successful school principals in the world, Alpha Education, where basically their thinking is actually we're going to rethink education. Children, because they're going to have bespoke tuition.
This is people in the same classroom
But
operating
every
at
child,
different speeds.
You got it. If you think about education traditionally, right? A teacher, no matter how talented they are and how brilliant they are, can only go as fast as the slowest child in the classroom.
Yes, you might have a child in year 7 that's
Right.
operating at year 9 or year 4.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, every child has their own bespoke tutor, effectively, with them that's able to identify where the weaknesses and focus on it to keep them moving forward. And the evidence is that you need probably about 3 hours a day of concentrated teaching, tuition. But the rest of the time is what they call touching the grass, team games, getting them away from machines altogether. Creativity,
arts,
all of that, right? Collaboration. So lots happening in that. I saw, I think yesterday, really interesting, that Elon Musk has teamed up with, again, the brilliant people at the UAE, where they're going to basically offer AI to the 100 most remote schools and poorest schools in the world through his Starlink work. That's I'm a big advocate of, if you're going to do aid, give people the tools, right, for prosperity. Don't keep giving them just food. So there will be, I agree with you, those with AI and those without. We've got to rethink, in many ways, our education delivery mechanism.
Unfortunately, we've just had a curriculum review, and whilst AI was mentioned, it's the first one we've had for about 13 years. Unfortunately, it wasn't really embedded in that. So I think that's, another key policy area to consider.
Problem. The problem is you've got analog departments, right, in now a hyper-digital age. Right? It's hard to keep up. It's how fast right, information is now being delivered. My view is just make sure you basically support the businesses. We've got some of the great universities of the world, right? People like Demis and others came out of our universities, right? What do we do more to keep supporting those universities, to attract the best talent, right? So they don't all end up in the Ivy League of America. Not that I've got anything against them, but you want to be at least have your share of the pie with them. And then, how do you try and keep them here and keep them growing? What do we do to incentivize the investors like yourself, the financial markets, to actually, support these businesses at, Series C, D, and so on? Because I think that's equally important. If, all we need is one, right, who can do an incredible thing, like ARM or some of the other companies that came out of UK universities
Yes.
to make a huge difference.
Yeah. So about a month ago, you decided to join Reform. It's quite a big change. You're one of probably the highest profile individuals who's defected to Reform. Just talk us through that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I had a choice. Fight or flight, right? What do I mean by that? I could have so easily just decided, you know what, this government's making such a mess of the economy, of immigration, of welfare. I'll just go and live somewhere else and take my family, and I'm privileged enough to be able to afford to. Lots of people aren't, right? And we always have to remember that, beyond about 2, maybe 3 square miles of where we're sitting today, right, it all feels okay, right? Because it's a pretty wealthy part of London we're in. Beyond that, I think most people are finding it a real struggle. Nothing really works properly. If they have to use A&E, they walk in and lose the will to live. Right? It could take up to 4, 5, 6, 7 hours of waiting time. The system is creaking. Mm-hmm. Taxes are too high. They're barely able to sort of make the budgets meet at the end of the month. So life is tough. And I chose to fight, not to fly. And I thought, you know what? If you put country ahead of party, which is the sort of the decision process I went through in my head last year, then there's only one real decision to make, and that is one outcome, which is to back Nigel and the Reform and to get them ready for government. That's my view, and that's the decision I took. I said at the press conference that he and I held that I had the ability to watch him up close and personal, how he dealt with world leaders, how he dealt with the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. I gave him a lot of evidence as to why I think we should prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood, their infiltration of our university student unions, their infiltration of lots of institutions across the UK is, I think, incredibly dangerous. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing the same happening in France and elsewhere in Europe. I sent the same thing to Kemi. I sent the same to Rob, who's a good friend. Mm-hmm. Rob came back, said, absolutely sensible, we should do it. But I don't think my party, he was then a Conservative, he said, mm-hmm. They won't do it. Nigel came back and said, can we just go through the details properly and look at it properly? And we did. And then just before their party conference, I was still a Conservative then, I get a message saying, look, I'm going to put it in my pledge, in my speech, we will absolutely prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood. And I thought that's one example of why I think someone like him is worth backing, because he sees this as ultimately his sort of last big job is to try and turn around the oil tanker that's moved in the wrong direction.
Just talking about the job, I mean, you've been very close to government, and it's a very complicated thing to do to run a country. You've got many issues, many draws on your capital needed constantly. It's relentless in the media and social media. Nigel is an amazing orator. He's one of the best we've seen in his generation. But speaking about issues versus delivering them are very, very different. Does Nigel really want the job of being Prime Minister?
Yes, he does. I'll tell you for why. Couple of things. One, not only does he deliver oratory, he goes against the fashion, let's put it that way. Right? I.e., he knows what he wants to do with power. Right? So much of what I've seen over 40 years of being a Conservative member and then sitting at the cabinet table, sadly looked more like a bunch of very clever, mainly men, who are very good at playing politics to see who wins the race to get to number 10, without really thinking about what they want to do with power. I was probably slightly naive, which is why I sort of sat in the back benches for probably at least the first half of my time in Parliament as your member of Parliament, because I thought you go in to try and make a difference, right?
Yes.
And actually, a lot of politicians go in for completely the wrong reasons, which is really just to sort of try and get to
One of the
10,
90 ministers, yeah.
right? So that's one where I'm absolutely convinced that he is focused on delivering.
Mm-hmm.
Two, he's not afraid to go against the herd,
Mm-hmm.
right? When people,
That's for sure.
right, say, actually, you know, the perceived wisdom, you know, is for us to, you know, continue with net zero or to, you know, go out and do ID cards, right? Nigel would say, no, you know, stop for a second, right? We've got a limited amount of time
Mm-hmm.
and a set of priorities that we've got to fix, right? We've got to fix the economy. We've got to fix immigration, right? These things are important, and fixing the economy is deep. There's a lot of stuff in there. You know that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've just talked about energy. There's lots of other things that you've got to still do. 25,000 pages of the tax code. You know, what's that all about?
It's crazy.
Right?
Yeah.
How does that help anyone deliver prosperity, deliver growth? Right?
Yeah.
You're seeing UAE 7% growth, 7.7, I think they've just announced. Right? US is over 5% now. The biggest economy in the world is at 5%.
2.5% is AI investment in that world.
I
but
don't
yeah.
disagree
Yeah,
with you,
yeah.
but my point being is, and we're sort of sitting here going, oh, it might be 0.8 or 0.9,
Yeah.
you know, at a push. Come on, this is a.
So he wants to lead the change.
He wants to lead the change,
Yep.
right? What concerns him, which again got me over the line, because I thought, actually, if he's thinking in this way, that tells me that's another sort of signal that he is serious about delivery and actually stands a better chance of delivering. Is the first thing he said to me, he said, I don't want to be the five-star movement of Italy, right, where we come in on...
Even though she's, you know, I mean...
No, Meloni's different.
Meloni's
The
different. So
five-star
five-star was the previous year.
was
right? Yeah.
before that, right? They rode
Yes.
a sort of a wave of dissatisfaction
Mm-hmm.
and disgruntlement with the sort of the
But it wasn't a
traditional-
serious party. It was led by a comedian, I think, wasn't it, actually? So,
right, and also what happened was within 5 weeks of winning, they unravelled, and so Nigel is very focused on, you know, looking at Meloni and Milei in Argentina, right? That to turn this big ship round is going to take some serious talent, serious people who've been in the room before, which is why he has, you know, he approached me, he approached, you know, Rob Jenrick, and
others to follow.
and others to follow, and I think, look, I don't care what your political persuasions are. If you agree with me that the country's broken and it needs to be fixed, that it has a real chance to be fixed, by the way, because the people of this country are bloody resilient and talented, right? They're just looking at their politics and thinking, where have we gone horribly wrong? How have we ended up, you know, in such a terrible place?
I think the word broken, I think, sometimes can be overused. I mean, we're in a change. You know, this isn't just a UK issue; it's a European issue. We're in a slow growth, no growth environment. We've got a welfare system ballooning. Something's got to give. And obviously, clearly, he admires Trump. There's no doubt about that. If I take my emotion out of my Trump views, I look at some of it and smile and think, actually, God, he's getting some stuff done, and he's ignoring the typical machine and cutting through. But the way he does it, you know, I was in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago when the second person was shot, seeing the protests on the street. The way he goes about delivering the results is very difficult for you to get your head around. So where does Nigel sit on that? There's no doubt he'll come in and want change, but how far is he prepared to push that change?
Oh, I think he exists because he knows this country has to be fixed. It has to, you know, and actually, it can be fixed. This is the big difference. You know, a few weeks ago, and this sort of slightly, you know, made me feel a little bit sad for my old party. You know, they tried to pick this argument about, oh, reform is all about the country's broken. It's not. You know, stop playing politics. Right? We know it's broken, and we know it needs to be fixed, and it can be fixed. Right? Once you admit that it's broken, then you can actually make some serious decisions. Right? Once I put my hand up, say, look, I was sitting around the table, right, when we made the wrong decision on mass migration, right? Unskilled migration is not what you need in an economy, right? Because they're going to be a drain on all the services in the economy. What you want is the best talent in the world
Yes.
to come here. pay their taxes, and build the future economy of the United Kingdom. Once you admit your mistake, then you can move forward. We got into a whole debate as Rob and Sweller and Andrew came across, and Rossendale came across, and it's just petty politics. And I just think, look, stop. Let's admit the mistake, right? Let's come together. The only way we're going to get rid of this government is if we get behind Nigel, build the capacity, as in the individuals who are going to be able to make those decisions, and we're going to fix stuff, right? People talk about, and again, I go back to, Fraser says, London murder rates are, as low as they've ever been historically. Mm-hmm. I don't disagree, right?
But petty crimes.
But look at what's happening. Difficult. Petty crime, theft of watches, everything from stabbings to all sorts of things that are happening, right? People don't feel safe, right? In the middle of the day in Richmond, right? A couple of guys spent half an hour, right, smashing a jeweller's shop, and no one's doing anything about it, mm-hmm. right? Who is in charge of the streets is what people are, the law-abiding silent majority are asking themselves.
Yes.
And so all these things you can fix, right? Because they're not beyond us. We managed to defeat a virus.
Yes.
We can do the same thing.
So in terms of the party, I mean, you're in a formation stage. It's kind of been a movement. In reality, it's now starting to attract in some experienced talent that have previously led. But building a culture is really important. We've seen in your old party 5 fractions. We see in the Labour Party today 5 fractions, and an inability for those groups of individuals to come together with cohesive policy changes. You are assembling an eclectic mix of individuals, there's no doubt about it, but as you move towards needing 400 members of parliament, how do you get that cohesion culture embedded in reform to allow it to succeed?
So I think, again, one of the reasons that I was persuaded is the big difference is Nigel has effectively set up the party, controls the party, and has made it very clear that if you want to be part of that party, right, here is an agenda that we're going to try and deliver against.
Is it his agenda, or will it be a broader agenda?
So the agenda has to be bought into, but the agenda was led by, to be fair to all of us, right, by Nigel, mm-hmm. with Richard Tice, Zia Youssef, mm-hmm. David Bull and others, right? And then others, and Lee Anderson, my colleague, was the first to, the lonely voice in Parliament who went across and said, actually, this makes sense to me, and he was right. If you're going to come and join, you're going to have to be part of that agenda. The difficulty for my old party was that, effectively, because it's a very old party, 100 years of history plus, right? You had different factions, and no one really was in charge, effectively. Nigel's in charge of this party. He has a set of priorities. Mm-hmm. If you believe in them, and you want to fix the problems that's where he got his priorities from, yes. Then you buy into it and you join and you do your bit, right? It's much clearer. The Conservative Labour Party, the old uni-party system, I think part of the problem is this petty politicking, because you've got this legacy institution that nobody really quite knows who controls it, because you've got in the NEC and Labour and all these different bits of it, institutions of it. You end up playing a lot of politics, wasting a lot of energy without delivery, mm-hmm. and the nation is sort of looking on, going, what are these people doing? Mm-hmm. I will never forget, and again I will say it here, and I'll apologise to your listeners and viewers. One evening, going home completely depressed from Parliament, mm-hmm. because, as you say, the 5 factions in the Conservative Party mm-hmm. were tearing each other apart, putting on the evening news, and I see my colleagues, who I thought I had a lot of respect for mm-hmm. in my party, the Conservative Party, coming out saying, the 5 families have met tonight and we're going to. And I'm thinking, if you're an ordinary Brit and you're worrying about paying the mortgage and you're worrying about your little business or where you work and the economy and your child's education and the local hospital, and you watch your political leaders coming out and saying the 5 families as if we're some sort of mafiosi.
Crazy.
Right? Crazy. No wonder they punish the Conservative Party. No wonder the brand is so damaged. Right? Mad. And Labour's doing the same thing now. They're tearing themselves apart. Why? Because they've clearly chosen the wrong leader. Right? He just doesn't have the attributes to be able to lead. And so now you've got, Angela Rayner trying to sort of very quickly get over her tax problems and raise
employment bills,
£1 million and do all her stuff for the left. I don't know where West Streeting is at, but the speculation is he's sort of playing both horses at the moment. The nation hates that.
If there was an election in the next few months, which is a possibility, would reform be ready, realistically? I mean, can you really assemble the troops required to fight an election with what might be 6 weeks' notice? Is that plausible?
Yes. If you look at the work the party did with my old colleague Ben Bradley on local government, you look at local government candidates that Reform is fielding, and you look at what Nigel did earlier last week on opening up the applications for people to come forward to be a Reform candidate for a general election. I think there's a real sense of coming together, energy, and people just saying, "This is our last chance. This is the last time we're going to be able to try and turn things round." And so, one, I think we'll be ready. Two, and again, credit to Nigel. This is not my idea, right? I've got lots of ideas of how I want to fix the civil service with Danny Kruger, who's doing a brilliant job of just sort of thinking through what we need to do inside the civil service. But Nigel, before Zahawi even began to engage with Farage, was like, we're going to bring, 100 of the best people in the country. This country has unbelievable talent, right? I see it here in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, in
we have
the
unbelievable
UK.
talent.
Go to Belfast University and look at the cyber talent we've got. Right, incredible. Literally, I see it around the world. Right, I sit in meetings around the world, and it's pretty much the big decision makers are Brits. Right?
Brits, British educated.
The man who built Emirates Airlines, one of the most successful airlines
Yeah.
in the world, right, is a Brit. Right? So we've got the people. Most countries, most political leaders, struggle for capacity, talent. We've got the talent. We've just decided to ignore them. Right? We decided to sort of have this system over here that's sort of alien to the rest of society.
So talking of talent, I mean, can we see a return to frontline politics for you?
If I'm asked, of course I will. I said to you, part of the reason my decision had to be fight or flight, right?
But that means serving again.
And that means serving again. I think this is genuinely, if we don't get rid of this government, or even worse, if we end up with a rainbow coalition of Green, Yellow and Labour, I think it would be an economic disaster. We are already in a bad place. We need growth to pay for the increase in defence spending, which we're going to need to do anyway. And we can talk about the reasons behind that, and the changing world and the sort of Europe having to step up, including the United Kingdom. Where are you going to pay for it from? Right? You need growth.
Which is anemic.
Growth can only come when Steve Rigby leaves this room and goes, do you know what? This government is going to basically, back me or just get out of my way, right? And let me get on and build what I need to build. And I feel that, I'll be able to earn a fair amount of the wealth I create.
Yes.
Right? It's not rocket science, right? I just need things to work. The same thing will apply to whether it's the NHS or education, right? Follow the evidence, look at the data, build a process, and we'll make it work. And we have the talent.
Yeah. So Boris Johnson was a friend, may still be a friend.
Still is a friend.
What is your view on Boris coming across to reform?
Boris won't. and I don't think Nigel would want Boris to come across. I think it's not a secret that he sees, as he refers to it, the Boris wave as really fundamental to the breaking of some of our institutions in this country that we're going to need to fix. Boris remains a friend, and he kept me on as his Chancellor, even though I had to write to him the night before to say, look, the herd is stampeded. You've got to consider your position. I saw him after my announcement, and he said, as he's always been generous of heart, he said, you broke my heart. I'm sorry that you've made this decision, but we'll find out whether you've made the right decision. I.e., what I said to you earlier about if you put country ahead of party, there's only one decision to make, which is build capacity and reform, get it ready for government, because that's the only way we're going to turn this country around. He's enjoying writing what I hope will be a brilliant book on Shakespeare, and so he's going to be visiting us in Stratford-on-Avon.
Very good.
But no, he's in good shape. Good.
And word on the street is that there's potentially some Labour defectors coming across, which is quite unthinkable to go from the left to what is at this stage a relatively hard right. So, what's your thoughts there around other political parties potentially joining reform?
I would take issue with the hard right bit, because I just think, as you and I have been discussing,
yes,
a lot of what we are now talking about that the nation actually agrees with us on,
yes,
right, is sensible policies like coming out of the ECHRC, where not a long time ago, people thought that was hard right,
yes,
as a view. The reality is we have to come out of the
to give yourself flexibility.
Give ourselves flexibility.
Yeah.
And
I think the Maloney experiment's been really interesting, because clearly she was quite far towards the right, but actually is a centre-right politician doing a very good job.
Totally.
And actually the reality of governing a country is that you have to head more towards the centre, because there are so many day-to-day issues to deal with. Yes, you can have change, and I think the country does need change. Whoever's delivering that change, again, I'm apolitical, so for me, I won't comment on which is the right party to do it. But in reality, you're going to have to find some middle ground. You can have some more right-wing policies, but you've got to have some stuff in the middle.
I would say to you that you look at what Nigel has done. It is literally just looking at the evidence and saying, how do I fix it? What is the sort of common sense fix that I can fix some of this stuff? Now, most of it, what I would call the sort of the machine used to think, or at least used to deliberately maybe label all this stuff as, oh, this is hard right stuff. And when you start talking about illegal migration and having to process them offshore, not a long time ago, I was witness to discussions with that. Does that make us really bad? How do we sell that to the nation, because they're going to think we're fascists? That's not true, right? And that's very much where, to his credit, to what he's done with his team, with Zia and Richard and the others, to say, look, we're going to have to make some tough decisions, right? I can't sort of flannel you and sell you a story just because the mainstream media doesn't want me to look, or will label me as nasty or whatever.
We know in business, tough decisions is what it's all about, making a difference.
Totally. But look at how he pushed back on Elon, on Tommy Robinson.
Yes.
Right? He came under huge pressure to say that actually reform should join with Tommy Robinson, and Nigel said no. Now, I think that's good leadership, right? And I would say to you, I would come away from this thing about, what does it mean about where you should be on the sort of political scale. Actually, what this country needs is fixes. How do we start to control our borders. You talked about Trump earlier. One of his great successes is controlling
No doubt.
the border.
In record time.
Right? In record time, when every other politician in DC would make all sorts of excuses or say it's not doable.
He's just gone too far now with ICE.
Right. So my point is, if you follow the evidence, you can fix some of these things. Mm-hmm. Now, where they sit on the sort of the left or right scale, I don't care. Almost right. I just want them fixed, and I think that's where the nation is at. So, look, I think if we see defections from Labour, which I think we will, it'll be the sensible Labour MPs or ex-MPs who maybe belong to that group who share the same thing as most what I'd call working class people view is, which is unskilled mass migration is hurting.
Yes,
sort it out. Make sure that I've got a job, that I'm not getting crushed into the dirt through high taxation.
My children can be educated.
My children can be educated. When I need the health service, it's there for me. All these are basic things.
In a civilised society.
Right?
Yeah. So we're lucky enough as Rigby Group to have the biggest foundation in the West Midlands, and giving in our case, to disadvantaged children in the education system is our main thrust. But we give a charitable donation for attendance on this to try and justify how you spend your time, and your time's very valuable. So just share with us the charity that you've got in mind for us being able to give a donation to.
So I am going to ask you to give a donation to the Adam Smith Institute.
Okay.
Why? Because
tell us what it does.
So it's a think tank, one of the oldest. It's over 40 years old, and when I left government, one of the brutal things that happens is when the Secretary of State or the Minister leaves, all your special advisors get sacked on the same day.
Yes.
Thing, right? Nobody ever sort of talks about that bit, but it's pretty brutal on some young, very clever people. Anyway, they found birth at the Adam Smith Institute, and they're basically, hopefully, putting together some of the ideas for not necessarily for reform, but for the country. For the country, and so I want to support them. Brilliant young minds, and so I thought for the Adam Smith Institute as a think tank.
Great.
And it's back to yours and my passion, which is actually, it is the economy, stupid.
Yes.
Right? If you can make the economy work,
where
we can pay for everything else, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're not having to borrow money, right? If we're running a surplus, I'd happily sit here and say, look, let's do all the other stuff that we can do for other countries as well.
People don't realise the greatest gift in finance is compounding. And if we can get the country to compound at 2.5%,
it's huge.
It explodes.
It's huge.
Mathematics explodes.
It's huge.
Yeah. So we've got the policy fix, and the discussions today are leading us perhaps maybe to you making one recommendation. So you've got a magic wand. You can fix a policy. It can be anything. Tell me what that would be.
I would abolish inheritance tax. I tell you for why. It is unfair. It is inefficient. And actually, it has perverse outcomes. Why? Those who are against this policy would say it's only 4% of estates that pay it, and you're helping the richer states. Actually, it's 4% every year. So in a lifetime of Parliament of 4 or 5 years, that's a lot of people. The average estate is about 4 adults because you've got brothers and sisters. And the other thing that it will do is will encourage lots of families that have created wealth from around the world to hold UK assets, right? Because they'll feel that they can hold them safe in the knowledge that they will be able to pass them on for generations. I think it's a no-brainer. I tried to get Rishi to do it. He said he'd rather do the NI cut.
Which in hindsight I think was a mistake.
I think
19 billion in the 2 cuts.
I agree with you. I said to him at the time, I said, look, I ran a business with hundreds of people in it, now thousands of people in it. I've never had a single person say to me, I know exactly what, all the people worry about is what goes into the bank account, the net pay. But I think it would be a game changer. Genuine. And it would send such a message to the rest of the world as well.
Yes.
Back to the thing about a connected world, a world where today people are looking for, efficiency, growth, margin. What an emblematic policy to say, come and invest in the United Kingdom, and you can pass it on for generations. And for families here, that sort of the ability to generationally keep the business going, whether it's a farm or any other business. What a great thing it would be, and it would very quickly send a message to everybody
we're open for business.
That we're open for business.
Yeah, it's a double taxation. I know it's deemed to be a tax for the minority, but in reality, if you applied that taxation to the whole public, we would have national outcry. I've been very lucky to lead on my role as chair of Family Business UK the campaign to try and reverse the tax that taxes family businesses. And we've got some relief. It's not gone far enough. I hope that in the next election that does become a meaningful issue. Funding an abolition of inheritance tax is a big number. And I think, it's responsible.
I did have a policy solution for it, for Rishi. But again, he didn't take it. I said, what we do, and Maloney was then, we've been talking a lot about Maloney in this hour, but she had introduced a flat rate of tax for international residents, which was €100,000 per adult per year.
Yes, now 200,000.
Now she's going to go to 300, by the way, because the demand is so high. I said, London is 10 times better than Milan.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Make it $250,000 per adult per year, and everyone will come here.
Yep.
Right? No, didn't like it, didn't do it. Of course, now Trump has the Trump gold card.
Yes.
Right? And we'll very soon see the numbers. I'm sure they would have done incredibly well.
Yes.
But that would have paid for the inheritance tax.
Yes.
In my view. I'd done some work with the Adam Smith Institute, which we talked about earlier, but alas, it didn't happen.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, so thank you.
It's great to be with you.
So I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to see more episodes of The Policy Fix, please click here.